film begins with an old woman telling a story to her granddaughter. She tells many years ago, a woman lives in a city. She works as product seller and sells things door to door. One day when she was returning, she sees big bungalow in the mirror of her car. The seller thinks of going there, and upon reaching she gets surprised. Actually, she was surprised by the view outside the bungalow because the trees were cut beautifully. Later, she goes inside and could not find anyone. She was seeing around and then hears someone's voice from upstairs. She moves upstairs while chasing the voice and sees someone sitting in a shadow. The lady calls him and asks him to come out. When he comes, the lady gets scared with his hands. She thinks of leaving, but he stops her and says, "Please don't go." The lady turns and understands that those were not weapons but his hands. The lady asks his name and he says, "My name is Edward." He tells her, "I am not human, I am an unfinished robot." She feels bad for him, and even he himself never wanted those hands. The lady shows sympathy and takes him with her. Edward was watching the things around while sitting in the car with her, and he was excited and happy, because he was seeing the real world for the first time. The lady brings him to her home and gives him clothes to wear. Edward couldn't wear the clothes because of the Scissorhands. The lady helps him and then introduces him to her family at lunch. She was treating him like humans even if he is not. They offer him food but he can't eat. Next day, the lady's husband was cutting the trees, then Edward arrives and turns a tree into dinosaur. The lady's husband gets surprised after seeing this. Later, he turns those trees into their family statues. When their neighbors discover that there was a new guest in that lady's house, they rush to meet him. They ask to the seller, "We want to meet your guest at dinner." The lady gets busy to make food for night and Edward also helps her. He was cutting the vegetables like a machine. Then the lady was opening the seal of the box with a machine, and by this, Edward goes into flashback. An old scientist, who was testing machines, that makes food. Then he goes to robot and places a heart-shaped cookie on his heart. Here we discover the incomplete robot is none other than Edward. The scientist turned him into today's Edward after a lot of hard work. He was also given human feelings by that scientist, and that is why he is called a robot like human. However, he is still incomplete because of his scissor hands. The scientist was about to change his hand, but then the scene shifts to the present, where everyone has come to meet special guest Edward. Everyone becomes surprised by his hands. Edward was sleeping in his room at night, then the lady's daughter named Kim comes there. She returned after a long time because she was on a trip. He was watching her while lying on the bed, then Kim sees him and runs outside after getting scared. Her mother reassures her that she should not be afraid because he is Edward and will live with us. The next day, Edward turns all trees and the surroundings into beautiful shapes. While he was cutting, a dog comes to him who has long hairs, and he gives him a nice hairstyle. After this, every other neighbor gets there with their dog for the haircut. Edward was an expert in it and does it speedily and neatly. He gives a lion's look to a lady's dog, and after seeing this she was so happy that she asks him, "Will you cut my hair?" Edward does the same and starts cutting her hair. After her, all the females make him do their haircut. Edward was talented, so he becomes famous and gets called to on a TV show. Everyone asks him to open a salon because he does everything worth appreciating. It is obvious he will need money for that, so the seller takes him to a bank for a loan. He is denied a loan by the bank because he doesn't have a source of income. He doesn't even have a bank account or doesn't have any ID. Nothing matters to Edward as there is no value of money in his life. He just likes one thing, that is the seller's daughter Kim. Kim also likes him, but her friend was jealous of him, so he makes a plan. He says to Kim, "We will go to meet our parents at night and we will steal my father's van. Then we will go to a separate place, there we can spend a lot of time together. My father will get insurance money, and for this, we will need Edward's help because only he can open the lock with his scissor hands." Edward gets ready to go with them as Kim asks him to. Then they go inside the house to open the locks, but the alarm starts ringing. The shutter of the room starts shutting automatically. Everyone runs except Edward, so Kim wants to take him out, but her friend stops her. Meanwhile, the police reach there and catch Edward, but he doesn't tell them that there were Kim and her friends with him. Then Edward was taken to court, but judge releases him, on the ground that he was alone for many years and doesn't know the difference between good or bad. Edward returns to home and Kim thanks him for not taking their name in court. Kim says, "This is my mistake, I should have told you the truth about the robbery." Edward says, "I had known it already." Kim asks, "If you had known this, why didn't you said anything at that time?" Edward says, "Because you asked me to do this, I didn't said anything." Likewise, the respect and love for Edward in Kim's heart increases. On the Christmas, Edward makes a huge and lovely statue of ice for Kim. Edward sharpens the ice and that starts ice fall in the town. Kim enjoys it, but he doesn't know that Kim has arrived there. Meanwhile, Kim's friend arrives and says hi in a loud voice. Hearing the voice, Edward loses his attention and cuts Kim's hand mistakenly. Kim tells her mother he did it by mistake. She bandages her, and Kim's friend, who was with Edward, misbehaves and pushes him. He asks him to go away, so Edward was leaving from there being sad and angry. He cuts his clothes and the trees also. The neighbors, who were Edward's friend, now scared of him due to robbery, and a lady calls the police while seeing this. Kim shouts at her friend being furious and breaks her relation with him. Edward was sitting at the corner of the road being worried. Suddenly, a dog arrives and changes his mood, so he returns home and Kim becomes happy to see Edward. She asks him to hug her, but Edward says, "No, I can't do this because my hands are of scissors and I can't harm you." Hearing this, Kim goes to him and hugs him. Now Edward remembers the time when the scientist brought his hands to make Edward a complete human-like robot. But at the same time the scientist had a heart attack and he dies there, and that's the reason Edward still has scissor hands. Kim's friend was drunk and driving recklessly. After seeing this, Edward thinks Kim's younger brother is outside the house, so he rushes towards him. But after saving him, Edward's make cuts on his face. His face becomes injured, and he was screaming. Hearing his voice, Kim's parents and the people in the surroundings arrives and sees Edward attacking the kid. Kim's father also gets a cut from him. Then Kim's friend attacks Edward. Now, to save himself, he attacks Kim's friend. Meanwhile, the police arrive and Edward runs from there. Kim knows Edward's place, so she goes to him and finds him sitting depressed. Kim's friend also gets there and shoots Edward. Kim attacks him to save Edward, but he slaps and pushes her. Edward becomes furious, so he stabs his scissors into him. He dies after falling from window. Kim says, "Edward, I love you," and goes out of the house while saying goodbye. Here, Kim shows Scissorhands to everyone so that they will think he is dead. Then the story comes to the present, where the old lady was telling the story to her granddaughter. Here, the old lady reveals that I am none other than Kim. She claims that she believes Edward will be alive today, as I told you he isn't a human but AI means artificial intelligence. Then her granddaughter inquires, "Did you also love him? As he adored you, why you didn't go to meet Edward?" Kim says, "Because I have grown elder. I want Edward to remember or miss me always as he saw me the last time." Her granddaughter wonders how she can say this with such certainty that he is still alive. Kim says, "Because there was a snowfall when Edward came into this world for the first time. Even today there is a snowfall, and without Edward it won't be possible. Because Edward makes statues of angels, and due to ice cutting, it falls into the city. There was also a statue of Kim among the statues, and the movie ends here. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe as it will help the channel."